A dull, rhythmic pounding echoed through Kang Ji-hoon's skull as consciousness dragged him back from the void. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his body sluggish as if lead had replaced his blood. The air smelled of salt and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, waves crashed against jagged rocks, a slow and ominous drumbeat against the shore. He forced his eyes open. Sunlight burned. His blurred vision gradually sharpened, revealing a sky that stretched endlessly above him, cloudless and cruel. The sensation beneath him was alien, wet sand clinging to his clothes, his fingers half buried in the gritty texture. A gust of wind carried the scent of seawater and something more bitter: decay. Ji-hoon tried to push himself up, but pain flared across his ribs, a brutal reminder that something had gone terribly wrong. His head pulsed with a sharp, aching throb, like an echo of a blow he didn't remember receiving. His mind fumbled, trying to grasp at his last memory. Wine, a toast, Baek Min-kyu's steady gaze, and then nothing. Panic slithered up his spine. He staggered to his feet, his vision momentarily tilting as nausea swelled in his gut. The landscape before him was desolate, a crescent of rocky shore that bled into thick vegetation. There was no sign of civilization, no distant hum of traffic or city lights flickering on the horizon, only an endless stretch of ocean to one side and a dense jungle pressing in from the other. His pulse pounded against his temples. This wasn't a dream. This was real. A sharp, deliberate sound made him freeze. The crunch of a footstep against wet sand. Ji-hoon whirled around. A sleek black speedboat rocked gently against the tide, anchored just offshore. And standing on the beach, watching him with an expression of cold amusement, was Baek Min-kyu. Ji-hoon's heart slammed against his ribs. His former business partner was impeccably dressed as always, black slacks, an open-collared shirt that fluttered slightly in the breeze. His sharp features remained composed, the faintest hint of satisfaction playing at the corners of his lips. "You're awake," Min-kyu said, his voice smooth, unhurried. "I was beginning to wonder how much longer you'd sleep." Ji-hoon's hands curled into fists. His body was still sluggish, weak, but adrenaline fought to override it. "What the hell is this?" His voice was raw, edged with fury. Min-kyu sighed, almost as if disappointed. "Come now, Ji-hoon. You're a smart man. Connect the dots." Ji-hoon's mind worked furiously, piecing together fragments of memory. The wine, the dizziness, the darkness swallowing him whole. Drugged. That much was obvious. But why? His absence would be noticed immediately. A company as vast as JH Tech couldn't be stolen overnight. Unless... An icy weight settled in his chest. Min-kyu's lips curved slightly, as if sensing the realization dawn in Ji-hoon's mind. Ah, there it is. Ji-hoon's voice was a whisper, the words scraping against his throat. "You replaced me." A slow, mocking clap. "Very good, though replaced is such an ugly word. Let's say I upgraded you." Ji-hoon lunged, but the moment he took a step forward, Min-kyu simply lifted a hand. 3 men emerged from the shadows of the tree line, silent, imposing, armed. Ji-hoon ground his teeth, rage burning beneath his skin. He had no choice but to stop. "Do you remember that old philosophy we used to joke about in university?" Min-kyu mused, tilting his head. "That every empire is only one betrayal away from collapse?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "The company will continue without you. The world will believe that you're still running it." A smirk. "Because in a way you are." Ji-hoon's blood turned to ice. Min-kyu chuckled at his reaction, shaking his head as if Ji-hoon were a child struggling to grasp a simple concept. "He looks just like you," he murmured. "Moves like you. Speaks like you. And the best part? He doesn't fight back. He does exactly what I say. A doppelgänger." Ji-hoon's stomach churned. That's insane. Min-kyu shrugged. What's more insane? That I found someone who could imitate you, or that everyone around you was blind enough to believe it. A gust of wind howled through the empty shore. Ji-hoon felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically, but in the sense that his entire reality had just cracked apart. His company, his life, his identity, stolen, replaced, and no one even realized it. Min-kyu exhaled softly, slipping his hands into his pockets. I debated killing you. Ji-hoon went rigid. But then I thought, where's the poetry in that? A lazy smile. No, leaving you here is much more poetic. You will fade, Ji-hoon. You will disappear from the world, and no one will question it, because you no longer exist. Ji-hoon took a slow step forward, his fists clenched. I will come back, he said, his voice raw, unwavering. And when I do, I will destroy you. Min-kyu's smirk never faltered. He only turned, stepping back toward the speedboat. His men followed. As the engine roared to life, Ji-hoon watched, chest heaving, as the boat sped away, carving a sharp path through the water until it disappeared over the horizon. He was alone. The wind screamed, carrying the weight of his isolation, of his erasure. Ji-hoon slowly turned to face the jungle, the endless unknown ahead. His jaw tightened, his breath steadied. Min-kyu had underestimated him. This was not where Kang Ji-hoon's story ended. This was where his revenge began. The city glittered beneath the night sky, its skyline an endless sea of glass and steel, reflecting neon lights. From the penthouse office of JH Tech, Seoul pulsed with life, a stark contrast to the desolation of the island where Kang Ji-hoon had been abandoned. But inside this office, the man standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows was not Ji-hoon. His reflection stared back at him, a striking resemblance to the rightful CEO. Seo Hyun-woo, the imposter, was a mirror image in almost every way. The same sharp jawline, the same deep-set eyes, the same confident posture. But where Ji-hoon's gaze burned with intensity, Hyun-woo's held an eerie emptiness, as if he were an actor rehearsing a role he wasn't sure he could play. Behind him, Baek Min-kyu leaned against the sleek mahogany desk, watching him with an appraising look. You're adjusting well, Min-kyu mused, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. Not bad for a street rat. Hyun-woo didn't flinch at the insult. He had long since buried the version of himself that cared. Before he was Seo Hyun-woo, he was nothing. A ghost, forgotten by society. Now he was standing at the helm of an empire. And yet, something inside him twisted. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, feeling the weight of the expensive fabric against his skin. It was strange, wearing power, breathing it in as though it had always belonged to him. But it wasn't his, and the people around him knew it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. The glass doors slid open, and Lee De-yeon stepped inside, her movements graceful yet hesitant. Her long dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face of quiet strength and intelligence. She wasn't like the others, sycophants and executives who smiled too widely at him. She studied him. Hyun-woo straightened. Lee De-yeon. Her eyes flickered slightly. A shadow of something unreadable crossed her face. Had his voice sounded different? Had he faltered? Director Kang, she said smoothly, but there was a trace of hesitation in the way she addressed him. You requested the latest design prototypes. She handed him a sleek tablet. He took it, his fingers brushing hers briefly. A spark. Or maybe just his imagination. Thank you, he said, forcing himself to sound natural. De-yeon nodded, but she didn't leave immediately. Her gaze lingered, as if she were searching for something. Hyun-woo fought to remain still. Did she suspect? Had Ji-hoon left some imprint on her that he could never replicate? She finally spoke, her voice softer. Are you feeling all right? Minkyu's gaze snapped toward her. Hyunwoo swallowed. Why do you ask? She hesitated. It's just, you seem different. A dangerous silence filled the room. Minkyu's expression remained unreadable, but Hyunwoo could feel the warning radiating from him. Be careful. Don't slip. Hyunwoo forced a chuckle, feigning amusement. Running a company like this will change a man, don't you think? Daeyeon didn't look convinced, but she offered a polite nod. Of course, Director Kang. And then she was gone, leaving a whisper of her presence behind. As the door slid shut, Minkyu exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. She's sharp. Hyunwoo placed the tablet on the desk and turned back to the window. She knows something is off. Minkyu smirked. That's fine. Suspicion without proof is just paranoia. He downed the rest of his whiskey and placed the glass down with a quiet clink. But if she becomes a problem... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Hyunwoo clenched his jaw. Outside, Seoul gleamed with a million lights, but he had never felt more like a shadow. The night was merciless. Cold winds howled through the trees, rustling leaves in a ghostly chorus as Kang Ji-hoon trudged forward, his body heavy with exhaustion. The dense jungle pressed in around him, an unrelenting maze of twisted branches and damp earth. His once pristine suit was now in tatters, the fabric clinging to his skin, torn and stained from his struggle through the wilderness. He had lost count of how many hours had passed since Minkyu had abandoned him. The island was vast, isolated, forgotten by civilization. No boats, no signs of human life. Only the ceaseless crash of waves against the rocky cliffs below and the eerie hum of nocturnal creatures hidden in the undergrowth. Ji-hoon stumbled, catching himself against the rough bark of a tree. His breath was ragged, his body screaming in protest. He had never been weak. He had never been powerless. But now, stripped of his name, his company, and his very existence, he was nothing more than a man fighting to stay alive. A metallic taste coated his tongue, blood from where he had bitten his lip. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, inhaling sharply. Focus. Think. Survive. His mind reeled back to Minkyu's words. You will fade, Ji-hoon. You will disappear from the world. A slow, seething anger burned through his veins. No. He would not disappear. Somewhere, in the depths of this forsaken island, there had to be a way out. Ji-hoon forced himself to keep moving, pushing through the dense foliage. Each step sent jolts of pain up his legs, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was still alive. Pain meant he could still fight. Then, he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the island's natural symphony. Metal against metal. A sharp, distant clank. Ji-hoon went still, his pulse hammering in his ears. He turned his head, straining to hear beyond the rustling of leaves and the crash of the waves. There it was again. Clank, clank. A rhythmic, mechanical sound. A generator? Machinery? People. Hope ignited in his chest like a dying ember rekindled. He moved swiftly, weaving through the trees with renewed purpose. The closer he got, the clearer the sound became, accompanied now by faint voices. His heart pounded. Finally, he reached the edge of the forest and crouched low behind the thick vegetation. Beyond the trees, the ground sloped downward into a rocky clearing. And there, illuminated by the pale glow of floodlights, stood a dock. A single rusted cargo boat was moored at the end of the wooden platform, its hull battered by time and tide. A small warehouse-like structure loomed nearby, its doors slightly ajar. And outside, standing near a pile of crates, were two men. Ji-hoon narrowed his eyes. Their posture was relaxed, their conversation casual. Not guards, not professionals, smugglers, his fingers curled into fists. This was his way off the island. He had no money, no weapons, no allies, but he had something far more valuable: desperation, and nothing to lose. Ji-hoon steadied his breathing, his mind already calculating. He would need to get closer, assess the situation, find a way onto that boat without alerting them. But just as he shifted his weight forward, a dry twig snapped beneath his foot. The sound was minuscule, barely louder than the whisper of the wind, but it was enough. One of the men straightened, his head snapping in Ji-hoon's direction. Ji-hoon froze, heart slamming against his ribs. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, "Oi!" the man barked, reaching for something at his waist. Ji-hoon didn't hesitate. He ran, branches whipped against his skin as he bolted back into the jungle, his breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. Behind him, voices erupted in shouts, followed by the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. The bullet struck a tree trunk inches from his shoulder, splintering the bark. Ji-hoon ducked low, his mind racing. He had to disappear. Darting left, he veered toward a cluster of boulders, using the terrain to shield himself. Footsteps thundered behind him. 3, maybe 4 men now giving chase. They were shouting in a language he didn't recognize, but their intent was clear. Find him. Kill him. Ji-hoon's pulse roared in his ears. He had no choice. If he wanted to survive, he would have to fight. And he would, because Kang Ji-hoon did not disappear. The world had never felt so loud. Kang Ji-hoon stood at the edge of the harbor, his body still, but his mind racing. Neon lights flickered in the distance, their glow reflected in the rain-slicked streets. The air was thick with the mingling scents of salt water, fried food, and gasoline. He had spent days confined to silence, his existence reduced to nothing but survival. Now, the roar of civilization crashed over him like a wave. He barely recognized himself. A reflection in a store window caught his eye. The man staring back was a ghost of who he had been, his sharp features dulled by exhaustion, his hair unkempt, his clothes mismatched and stolen from the ship he had smuggled himself onto. Gone was the polished CEO of JH Tech. In his place stood a fugitive, a man erased from existence. His jaw tightened. Not for long. Pulling his hood lower, Ji-hoon moved through the streets, his steps careful but purposeful. Every decision from this moment mattered. He had no ID, no money, and no allies. The world believed he was still running his company. Except it wasn't him. It was the man wearing his face. A bitter taste filled his mouth. Min-kyu thought he had won. Ji-hoon's fingers curled into fists as he slipped into a narrow alleyway where a dimly lit payphone stood like a relic of another time. He reached into his pocket, feeling the smooth edge of a single coin he had taken from the smuggler's boat. He slid it into the slot and dialed. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. Then a voice, low, cautious. "Who is this?" Ji-hoon exhaled slowly. "Choi Yoon-seok, it's me." A long silence. Then, "Prove it." Ji-hoon's grip tightened on the receiver. "I once caught you hacking into the security mainframe of JH Tech's headquarters. You said it was for practice. I told you I wouldn't fire you if you worked for me instead." Another pause. Then a quiet curse. "Ji-hoon?" The voice wavered, disbelief thick in the single syllable. Ji-hoon's throat tightened. The first time someone had said his name in weeks. "I need your help," he said. 20 minutes later, Ji-hoon sat in the backseat of a black sedan, the city lights blurring past the rain-streaked windows. Choi Yoon-seok gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He wasn't a man easily rattled. His sharp eyes and lean frame made him look more like an underground broker than a cybersecurity expert. But right now, he kept glancing at Ji-hoon as if he were a ghost. Yoon-seok exhaled. "I don't understand. The news, the company, the board meetings. I saw you..." Ji-hoon's lips curled bitterly. "No, you saw him." Yoon Seok didn't argue. He had worked with Ji-hoon long enough to recognize the controlled fury beneath his words. Instead, he let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. This is insane. He turned onto a quieter road, the tires slicing through a puddle. So what's the plan? Ji-hoon leaned back, his jaw tense. First, I need to know everything. What's changed since I disappeared? Yoon Seok swallowed hard. A lot, but the biggest change? Lee Da-yeon. Ji-hoon's head snapped toward him. What about her? She's watching him. Yoon Seok cast a quick glance at him. She knows something's off. She doesn't say it outright, but I can tell. The way she looks at him. She's trying to figure him out. A flicker of something unfamiliar stirred in Ji-hoon's chest. He hadn't expected that. He turned to the window, his reflection barely visible in the dark glass. Da-yeon was sharp, always had been. If she was suspicious, it meant Hyunwoo wasn't as perfect as Min-kyu had hoped. But that also meant she was in danger. Ji-hoon's grip on his knee tightened. Min-kyu wouldn't allow loose ends. We have to move carefully, he muttered. If he finds out she suspects anything. Yoon Seok's lips pressed into a thin line. She'll be next. The words hung heavy between them. Ji-hoon closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. He wouldn't let that happen. He was taking back everything. And it started now. The JH Tech headquarters loomed before him, its glass facade reflecting the golden hues of the morning sun. From across the street, Kang Ji-hoon, now Han Jun-seo, watched employees filter into the building. Some walked in groups exchanging laughter, while others scrolled through their phones, immersed in their routines, oblivious to the deception unfolding within. He exhaled slowly. This was the first time he had set foot near his empire since the night Min-kyu had stolen it from him. A wave of something unfamiliar washed over him. Not just anger, but loss. He had built this company. And now, a stranger wore his face, sat in his office, and pretended to be him. Ji-hoon clenched his fists. Not for long. A black car pulled up to the curb, and the moment the back door opened, his breath caught. Lee Da-yeon. She stepped out, adjusting the strap of her handbag. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, framing her delicate but perceptive features. There was an elegance to the way she moved, graceful yet purposeful. But what drew him in wasn't just her beauty. It was her expression. She wasn't smiling. Her gaze was sharp, guarded. Even from this distance, Ji-hoon recognized it. She was thinking, questioning. She knew something wasn't right. His jaw tightened. She had to be careful. With his cap pulled low over his eyes, Ji-hoon turned away and crossed the street toward the lobby. He couldn't afford to be recognized. The interior of JH Tech was just as he remembered it. Sleek, modern, and pulsating with quiet efficiency. Employees moved in choreographed motions, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards filling the air like an unspoken symphony. Ji-hoon walked toward the reception desk. A woman barely glanced at him before checking the temporary badge he had received through Yoon Seok's connections. Han Jun-seo, consulting specialist, she read before nodding. You're expected on the 10th floor. He thanked her and stepped into the elevator, his pulse steady but alert. The door slid shut, enclosing him in silence. Then, a voice. You're new here? Ji-hoon stiffened. Slowly he turned his head. Lee Da-yeon stood beside him. His breath hitched for the briefest second before he forced himself to remain calm. The last time they had been this close, she had been speaking to his imposter. Now, she was standing next to the real Kang Ji-hoon, and she didn't even know it. He cleared his throat, keeping his voice controlled. Yes, just started today. She studied him. Department? Consulting. I'll be reviewing project efficiency. Her brows lifted slightly. Interesting. Who hired you? Ji-hoon's mind worked fast. She's testing me. Baek Min-kyu. He said the name evenly, watching her reaction. Something flickered across her eyes. I see, she murmured. The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open. Da-yeon stepped out first, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Ji-hoon followed, his gaze steady on her back. She didn't trust Min-kyu. That much was clear, which meant she was already in danger. Hours later, Ji-hoon sat in a sleek conference room, his hands folded neatly on the table as a presentation played before him. Numbers, graphs, projections, none of it mattered. Not when she was sitting across from him. Lee Da-yeon barely glanced at the screen. Instead, her gaze flickered toward him. Subtle, but consistent. Like she was trying to place him. Ji-hoon remained still, keeping his breathing measured. And then, the unexpected happened. A sharp crack of thunder rumbled through the sky, rattling the glass windows. The lights flickered. The power cut out. A murmur rippled through the room as darkness swallowed them whole. Then, dim emergency lights hummed to life, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Ji-hoon exhaled quietly. A moment later, he felt it. A hand brushed against his sleeve. Light. Fleeting. But enough. He turned his head, and even in the dim glow, he could see her eyes on him. Strange, Da-yeon murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Ji-hoon kept his expression neutral. What is? She hesitated, then so softly he almost didn't hear it. You remind me of someone. His pulse pounded. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside this room, inside this fleeting moment, Ji-hoon realized something dangerous. Lee Da-yeon wasn't just suspicious. She was close to uncovering the truth, and he didn't know if that made him relieved or terrified. The storm had passed, but Lee Da-yeon felt unsettled. She sat at her desk, fingers poised over the keyboard, but her mind was elsewhere, on him. Han Jun-seo, the new consultant. The man who had appeared out of nowhere. The man who, in the dim glow of the emergency lights, had looked at her with an intensity that felt like déjà vu. She shook her head, exhaling slowly. No, it's impossible. Kang Ji-hoon was still in charge. She saw him every day, but the feeling wouldn't leave her. She leaned back, chewing on the end of her pen as her gaze drifted across the office. The energy in JH Tech had changed. It was subtle, but undeniable. Conversations hushed when Min-kyu entered a room. Employees whispered about strange financial shifts. Projects halted for no reason. Key investors pulling out. And Ji-hoon, or the man wearing his face, was different. She had known Kang Ji-hoon for years. He was sharp, relentless, charismatic in a way that commanded both admiration and fear. But now, there was something off. His eyes lingered in places they shouldn't. His decisions lacked confidence. He hesitated in ways Ji-hoon never would. And then there was Han Jun-seo. The way he carried himself. The way he listened, really listened. The way his fingers had brushed against hers in the dark, and for a brief second, it had felt exactly like Ji-hoon. A cold chill ran down her spine. She needed to know the truth. That night, the office was nearly empty when Ji-hoon entered a restricted archive room. Rows of locked cabinets stretched before him, holding confidential company records. He exhaled, pulling out a set of copied security keys Yoon-seok had obtained. One of these cabinets held the proof he needed to expose Min-kyu. He worked quickly, his fingers steady despite the pounding in his chest. Every second counted. Then, a sound. Soft. Barely there. But enough. He wasn't alone. Ji-hoon tensed. Then, deliberately, he continued flipping through the files. If you're going to watch me, he said evenly, you might as well step into the light. Silence. Then, the soft click of heels against the tiled floor. Lee Da-yeon. She stopped a few feet away, Her arms crossed. Her dark eyes, so often warm, were now sharp, calculating. "You're not just a consultant, are you?" Ji-hoon inhaled slowly. This was dangerous. "You've been following me," he said. She tilted her head. "You make it hard not to." The tension between them crackled. "I do my job well," he said carefully. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Too well. You walk these halls like you own them, like you've walked them 1,000 times before." Ji-hoon remained still. Dahyun took a step closer. "And then there's your voice, the way you speak, the way you pause before answering certain questions, as if you're deciding what not to say." Another step. "You even smell the same." Ji-hoon's breath hitched. Her voice was softer now. "Say my name." His throat tightened. He knew what she was doing. Ji-hoon had a distinct way of saying her name, a cadence only she would recognize. It was a trap, but he couldn't lie. Not to her. Lee Da-yeon. The moment the words left his lips, her eyes widened. A sharp inhale, a step back. "No." She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's impossible." Ji-hoon exhaled, his gaze unwavering. "It's me." She clutched her arms as if trying to steady herself. "No, you've been here. You've been running the company. The man you see every day is not me." Ji-hoon took a slow step forward. "Min-kyu put someone in my place. A double." Dahyun's mind reeled. It was insane. Insane. But deep down she had already known. The hesitation in his imposter's voice, the unfamiliarity in his gaze, the way her heart had told her, over and over, that something was wrong. Her fingers curled into fists. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ji-hoon's jaw clenched. "Because I couldn't risk Min-kyu knowing I was back. I needed time." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "And you thought I was a risk?" Ji-hoon stepped closer. "No." His voice was low, steady. "I thought you were in danger." The weight of his words settled between them. She swallowed hard, looking into the eyes of the man she had mourned without realizing it. This was him. This was the real Kang Ji-hoon. And now, they were both caught in a game far more dangerous than either of them had imagined. The silence between them was suffocating. Lee Da-yeon's breath came in uneven bursts, her pulse a frantic rhythm in her ears. The air in the archive room felt heavy, charged with something between disbelief and inevitability. Kang Ji-hoon was standing before her. Not the man she had seen in meetings, the one with the right face, but the wrong soul. The real one. The realization threatened to pull the ground from beneath her feet. "This is impossible," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't. Ji-hoon's jaw was tense, his eyes dark with something between regret and urgency. "It doesn't matter how impossible it seems. You know the truth now." Her fingers clenched. "How did this happen?" His gaze flickered to the partially opened cabinet behind him. The dim glow of the emergency lights cast jagged shadows across his face. Everything about this moment felt stolen from reality. "Min-kyu," he said at last. Just his name was enough to coil fury in her chest. "I suspected him," Dahyun admitted. "Something felt wrong." Her voice wavered. "But I never imagined this." Ji-hoon took a slow step forward. "He replaced me, put someone in my place." His voice dropped. "And now, I need to take back what's mine." Her pulse skipped. The way he said it, like it wasn't just a mission, but a promise. Dahyun swallowed, forcing herself to think past the chaos in her head. "Then we have to be careful. If Min-kyu knows you're here." The sudden, sharp sound of footsteps in the hallway made both of them freeze. Ji-hoon reacted instantly. He grabbed Dahyun's wrist and pulled her behind a row of shelves just as the door creaked open. From the shadows, she could feel the heat of his body close to hers, the strength in his grip. Solid, Real. Unmistakably Ji-hoon. Her heart pounded against her ribs as two figures entered the room. Min-kyu's men. "Check the files," one of them muttered. "Director Bayek wants to know if anything's been tampered with." Ji-hoon's grip on her wrist tightened slightly, a silent warning. "Don't move, don't breathe." Da-yeon pressed herself against the metal shelf, every nerve on edge. She felt Ji-hoon shift, his body close enough that she could feel the faint rise and fall of his breathing. The guards moved, flipping through documents, their backs partially turned. This was their chance. Ji-hoon's lips barely moved as he whispered, "On my count. 3, 2. Before he could say 1, Da-yeon took his hand. Ji-hoon tensed. Then, moving together in perfect silence, they slipped toward the exit. 1 step, 2. Then, "Wait!" Da-yeon's stomach lurched. One of the men turned, eyes narrowing. His gaze swept over the room. He was looking right at them. Ji-hoon's fingers tightened around hers. He stepped forward just slightly, blocking her from view. The guard hesitated, his brow furrowed. He squinted in their direction, as if sensing something was off. Ji-hoon didn't move. Then, the man shook his head. "Let's go. We'll check the security feed later." They left. The door clicked shut behind them. Only when the footsteps faded did Ji-hoon exhale, his breath warm against Da-yeon's temple. She hadn't even realized how close he was. Her hand was still wrapped around his. She pulled away quickly, clearing her throat. That was too close. Ji-hoon's eyes flickered to the door. "They'll check the footage." She nodded. "We need to erase it." His lips curved slightly. "I was thinking the same thing." A pause. Then, "We make a good team," he said, watching her. Something unfamiliar bloomed in Da-yeon's chest. Not just fear, not just adrenaline, but something dangerously close to trust. She pushed it down. "We should go before we run out of luck." But as they slipped into the dimly lit hallway, Da-yeon knew something had changed. The truth had been revealed. The city lights blurred past them as the car sped through the empty streets. The rain had returned, drumming against the windshield in chaotic rhythms. But Lee Da-yeon barely noticed. Her hands trembled on her lap. Not from cold, but from the weight of what she had just done. She had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. Beside her, Kang Ji-hoon drove with one hand gripping the wheel, his expression unreadable. He had barely spoken since they left JH Tech, but his focus was razor sharp, his every movement calculated. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. "Somewhere safe." She exhaled sharply, pressing her fingertips against her temples. Min-kyu knows someone was in the archive room. If he finds out it was us... He already knows, Ji-hoon cut in. Da-yeon turned to him, her stomach twisting. "What?" He kept his eyes on the road. Min-kyu isn't stupid. He'll put the pieces together soon, if he hasn't already. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. And when he does, he'll come after you. The reality of those words sent a chill through her. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was war. Ji-hoon glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You should leave the city." Da-yeon's breath caught. "What?" "Go into hiding. Stay with family, someone you trust." She scoffed. "And what? Pretend none of this happened? Let you fight this battle alone?" Ji-hoon didn't respond. Her chest tightened. He was serious. "You think I can just walk away?" she asked, voice rising. "Yes." The car screeched to a sudden halt. Ji-hoon pulled into a dimly lit parking lot behind an abandoned building, shifting into park before turning to face her fully. The storm outside paled in comparison to the storm in his eyes. "Da-yeon," he said, his voice quieter now. "Min-kyu doesn't leave loose ends." Her pulse pounded. He was protecting her. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, a sharp crack shattered the night. Gunfire. Ji-hoon reacted instantly. He grabbed her, pulling her down as the car windows exploded. Glass rained down on them. Her ears rang, her pulse frantic. Ji-hoon covered her with his body, shielding her as another round of bullets slammed into the metal frame. They had found them. "We have to move," Ji-hoon murmured against her ear, his breath warm despite the chaos. He reached beneath the seat, pulling out a small handgun. She didn't even have time to question why he had a weapon. With one swift motion, he pushed the door open and pulled her with him. Cold rain drenched them instantly. "Run," he ordered. Dayan barely had time to react before he was pulling her toward the alley, his grip firm but careful. Behind them, dark figures emerged from a sleek black SUV, weapons raised. Ji-hoon fired once, a warning shot. They ducked into the narrow passage between buildings, their footsteps splashing against the wet pavement. Dayan's lungs burned. "Where?" Ji-hoon pulled her sharply to the side, flattening them against the cold brick wall. "Stay quiet." Her heart pounded. Rain trickled down her face as she clutched his jacket. Footsteps. Close. Searching. Ji-hoon pressed a finger to his lips, his breathing barely audible. Then, silence. The men were near. Too near. Dayan swallowed hard, every nerve in her body screaming. Then Ji-hoon moved. With deadly precision, he stepped out, catching one of the men off guard. Before the attacker could react, Ji-hoon disarmed him in one swift motion, knocking him unconscious with a single blow. Another gunshot whizzed past them, slamming into the wall. Dayan flinched. Ji-hoon grabbed her wrist. "Move!" They sprinted through the maze of alleys, the city lights flashing in distorted fragments. Then, suddenly, Ji-hoon stopped. Dayan crashed into him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "What?" He turned, his expression unreadable. Then, he placed something in her hand. A plane ticket. Her eyes widened. "No." "Go," Ji-hoon said, voice firm. "Get out of here." "No." Her hands shook. "I'm not leaving you." "Dayan." He said her name softly this time. She felt it in her chest. "I need to finish this," he whispered. Her throat tightened. A million things rushed to her lips, but only one mattered. "Come back." Ji-hoon hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, lingering just for a second. "I will." Then he turned and disappeared into the night. And Dayan was left standing alone, gripping the ticket like it was the only proof he had ever been real. The city felt different at dawn. From the rooftop of an abandoned building overlooking JH Tech's headquarters, Kang Ji-hoon watched the skyline shift from deep navy to muted gold. The world below carried on as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't been erased, as if Baek Min-kyu still controlled everything. Not for much longer. Ji-hoon's grip tightened around the phone in his hand. The screen displayed a single message from Yoon-seok. "The files are ready. The board meeting is in 1 hour. It's time." Ji-hoon exhaled slowly. This was it. The conference room on the top floor of JH Tech was flooded with morning light. A long glass table stretched down the center, where members of the board of directors sat in polished suits, murmuring among themselves. At the head of the table, Baek Min-kyu sat like a king. His sharp suit was immaculate, his smile controlled. He had no idea his kingdom was about to crumble. "Ladies and gentlemen," Min-kyu began, his voice smooth, "before we proceed with today's agenda." The doors slammed open. Ji-hoon walked in. The room froze. For a moment, silence stretched as every set of eyes widened in disbelief. And then, chaos. "CEO Kang?" someone stammered. "But how?" Min-kyu's smile vanished. His knuckles turned white against the table. "Security?" he barked, his voice tight. But before anyone could move, The projector flickered to life. A video began to play. Min-kyu's voice filled the room. "No, leaving you here is much more poetic. You will fade, Ji-hoon. You will disappear from the world, and no one will question it." Gasps rippled through the boardroom. Min-kyu shot to his feet. "Turn that off." No one moved, because the evidence didn't stop there. Screens filled with financial records, forged contracts, wire transfers, proof of Min-kyu's embezzlement, the money he had siphoned away under Ji-hoon's name. Ji-hoon's voice was calm when he spoke. "This is the man you trusted," he said, eyes sweeping across the room. "A man who stole not just money, but an identity. My identity." The weight of his words settled like thunder. Min-kyu's breath came in short, furious bursts, but then his lips curled. "You think this is over?" he hissed. Ji-hoon took a slow step forward. "No, Min-kyu. I think this is just the beginning." The doors burst open again, this time with uniformed officers. "Baek Min-kyu," one of them announced, stepping forward. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder." Min-kyu's composure snapped. "You think you've won?" he snarled, stepping toward Ji-hoon. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Ji-hoon didn't flinch. He didn't need to. Because the moment Min-kyu lunged, someone else stopped him. A hand grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with brutal efficiency. Ji-hoon's breath caught. Seo Hyun-woo, the man who had worn his face. Hyun-woo's expression was unreadable. He shoved Min-kyu toward the officers, his voice cold. "I'm done being your puppet." Min-kyu struggled, his furious curses echoing through the room as he was dragged away. Ji-hoon stood still. It was over. He had won. But as he turned his gaze to Hyun-woo, something unsettled him. Because the man who had lived as him, who had stolen his place, was watching him with unreadable eyes. Then, Hyun-woo turned and walked away, just like that. Ji-hoon felt the weight in his chest shift. One battle was over, but another had just begun. The air felt different, lighter. Kang Ji-hoon stood at the edge of the Han River, watching the gentle ripple of the water beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. The city stretched around him, loud, restless, alive. But for the first time in a long time, he felt still. Baek Min-kyu was gone. JH Tech was his again. And yet, there was an emptiness that victory couldn't quite fill. A presence that was missing. A voice he hadn't heard in weeks. Then, soft footsteps behind him. Ji-hoon knew who it was before he turned around. Lee Da-yeon. She stood a few feet away, wrapped in a beige coat, her dark hair falling in waves around her face. The wind caught the strands, brushing them across her cheeks, but her eyes never left his. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "You didn't leave." It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Da-yeon exhaled, her breath a soft cloud in the cool night air. "You told me to go." Ji-hoon swallowed. "And you didn't." She tilted her head slightly. "Did you really think I would?" He let out a slow breath, his lips curling into the faintest smile. He should have known. Da-yeon stepped closer. She was always the one to step closer. "I saw the press conference," she said softly. "Everything's back to normal." Ji-hoon let out a quiet laugh. "If normal means lawyers, reporters, and a boardroom full of old men questioning how I came back from the dead, then yes, everything's normal." A small smile ghosted across her lips. But then, her expression shifted. "You haven't come to see me," she said. "Not once since that night." Ji-hoon hesitated. She was right. For weeks, he had buried himself in fixing the company, in undoing the damage Min-kyu left behind. But some part of him had been afraid. afraid that she had only stayed because of the danger. Afraid that now, with the chaos over, she would see him differently. But looking at her now, he knew. She had never wavered. "You almost died because of me, Dayan," he said quietly. She didn't look away. "And I'd do it again." Something in Ji-hoon's chest tightened painfully. She meant it. She had always meant it. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. "I don't know if I know how to be anything other than Kang Ji-hoon, the CEO, the man who lost everything, the man who came back for revenge." He shook his head. "I don't know if I know how to just be." Dayan's gaze softened. Then gently, she reached for his hand, her fingers wrapped around his, warm, steady, grounding. "You don't have to know," she whispered. "Not yet." Ji-hoon let out a shaky breath. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe in something beyond the fight, beyond revenge, beyond the past. She gave his hand a small squeeze. "Walk me home?" Ji-hoon glanced down at their joined hands. Then, slowly, he laced his fingers through hers. "Yeah," he murmured. "Let's go." And as they walked into the city lights, side by side, he realized maybe this was only the beginning.